What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my 2024 impressions of The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. A game that, while I have played previously, I rather embarrassingly have never finished, and it's about time I got around to that as a guy who's known for covering RPGs. That said, at the beginning of this video, I'm going to be playing this on and off before releasing a retrospective of the title, probably towards the end-ish of April, maybe May at the latest. And the reason I'm covering this game now with this video is because I have an awkward amount of time in between my previous review and my next one, which is going to be Dragon's Dogma 2. Morrowind here is actually going to be the next old title I take a look at, which is what I usually do in between new releases, but I found myself with about 3 days or so between now and when Dragon's Dogma 2 releases, and so I figured I might as well make myself useful and get Morrowind started, as I knew tinkering with it, getting it all set up the way I wanted, and getting a character on the road to success, so to speak, was probably a good way to go before I dived into it properly in between these other games. So when it comes to talking impressions of Morrowind, probably the first thing you need to talk about in 2024 is what you're planning to do to get it running or stable, etc., whatever you want to call it, and you have a few options there. Now, when it comes to the vanilla version, you should be able to get that to run, but it can be unstable and you can run into all sorts of problems, which basically leads you to your two major options: modded vanilla or open Morrowind. Each has their pros and cons, but to put it very simply, modding vanilla Morrowind is great if you want to make extensive changes to the game that rely on, a couple decades worth of cumulative mods. However, that's a lot for somebody just looking to jump into the game, and more specifically, it's a lot for someone who just wants to experience what Morrowind is without running through a ton of mods, which leads me to what I went with, which is Open Morrowind. Open Morrowind is not a mod. It is an engine replacement that brings with it a whole host of improvements that allows the game to do things it could not do otherwise without a ton of mods, such as just little things like increasing your view distance, scaling the UI to modern resolutions. So for pure ease of use, if all you want to do is experience vanilla Morrowind and what that was like, Open Morrowind is the way to go. You just go download it off of its website, point it towards your installation of Morrowind. You do have to own Morrowind to make that work, at which point it will do what it needs to do to allow you to run the game with the new engine. And then, if you really want to, you can continue to mod it afterwards, though it's a little hit or miss as to what works and what doesn't in comparison to the vanilla games mods. And for someone like myself who just wants to take a look back and make a retrospective review about Morrowind, it really doesn't get much better than Open Morrowind, because one download and a couple of clicks and you're pretty much golden outside of adjusting some settings. At which point, you're free to jump into the game itself, and right away, I would say my impressions of this are off to a running start, which is in no doubt due to the fact that I just play all sorts of games these days, and was well aware that I needed to do some efficient leveling right out of the gate to get a character where I wanted them before I really started doing much. Because right as you get off the prison ship and onto the island of Morrowind, where everyone seems to hate you or want you dead, you're already going to be making some important decisions. But unlike the game's sequel, Oblivion, they didn't break the game with level scaling afterwards, so it's not as significant. But you're still going to make some important choices, like what race you want to play, the standard 10 Elder Scrolls races at this point. But of course, the bonuses in Morrowind are much more substantial and impactful than their sequels. For instance, if you play a beast race, a Khajiit or an Argonian, you don't get to wear footwear at all, so no boots. And while you can wear helmets, you can only wear open face helmets, no closed helmets. And then there's the actual racial bonuses they get, which are unique per race as well. And you're really just getting started, because next up you gotta make your class as you talk to the census office, as you are technically a released prisoner here. And while I don't want to get too deep in the weeds about how all of this part of it works, there is one thing I want to mention about this specifically, and it's because the sequel Oblivion really ruined this. And while technically it's a little broken in Morrowind, Morrowind doesn't feature as much level scaling as Oblivion does, so there comes a point in Morrowind where you will be stronger than everything else you meet. outside of like one enemy in the DLC, which infinitely scales to the player level in a very painful way. But otherwise, you will outlevel everything eventually. So even if you build a poor character, not really understanding how the multiplier bonuses to your stats or attributes increase as you level up and what you level up skills in matters, even if you don't get any of that and you build a poor character, you could eventually get over the hill of that difficulty curve. Whereas in Oblivion, with its leveled enemies, you could set yourself up for a really bad time with a poorly built character. Whereas here, it's just the beginning of the game that's going to suck. But to be fair, it usually sucks for most people because you start off very weak in Morrowind. And you're going to learn some hard lessons very quickly that Morrowind is very well known for these days, which is that as one of the first games to make a fully realized 3D world, as opposed to integrating things like sprites and whatnot here and there to sort of spoof it, Morrowind was completely 3D, which at the time was very new. However, some things kind of get lost in the translation, such as chance to hit. Now previously, with isometric style games or games with sprites, when you make an attack and it misses, there's not so much visual dissonance with what you're seeing versus what happened. Whereas in Morrowind, you can swing your sword at something, hit it, and not actually hit it. That is to say, you deal no damage. And this is because, based on your agility and your weapon skill, if you're using melee weapons, are used in combination with things like your fatigue to determine your actual chance to hit every time you swing against something. Which means, for me at least, the early game of Morrowind is all about maxing out that formula with weapon skill and your agility mainly to make sure you're hitting as often as possible, which will already make the game a lot easier. So I spent a fair few hours leveling these things up and just getting my character sorted out in the starting area of Seyda before heading to Balmora, because these days I know enough to know that Morrowind is a little easier if you do some certain things, and seeing as I actually want to finish the game this time, I dove headfirst into that, and truth be told, I think I overdid it just a tiny bit, because after I finished doing this, I went off to a cave right near the starting town, where there is a wizard who likes to throw fireballs at you, and I remember this guy because the very first time I ever played Morrowind, which truth be told I think was in like 2010 or something, mercilessly murdered me many times, which is where my first attempt to play this game actually ended, and I was not feeling it. As opposed to now, with all my hard-earned knowledge, I just kind of snuck up behind him and one-shot him with the old sneak attack crit, which was really funny and caught me a little off guard. And then after that, I wrapped up what I was doing in Seyda and headed off to Balmora. Before we talk about that, probably a good time to mention that my knowledge of Morrowind is a bit limited compared to other Elder Scrolls entries. Truth be told, I would say I probably know more about Daggerfall than I do Morrowind. And this is because in my previous attempts at playing this game, I would go through the starting town, Seyda, head to Balmora like you're supposed to, do some stuff there, wander around to Vivec when you eventually get sent to the city there, and by that point I'd usually get distracted or bored and I'd stop. And while I know a great deal about Morrowind's story and the lore and everything, I haven't actually experienced a lot of that for myself, which I think is going to be the fun of taking a look back at this particular game, is that so much of it I have not experienced firsthand. And for those watching this just completely unaware about it themselves, Morrowind does this really good job of just thrusting you into the world and forcing you to learn about it and get immersed in what it is, all while learning how to survive and thus master the wilderness and its intricacies, if you will. And it does that by giving you a very relaxed main story introduction. You arrive on Morrowind in a prison ship, you are a prisoner, but you are being released. You make your character, and the only direction you're given is that they'd like you to take a package to someone off in a nearby town. They even tell you exactly how to get directly to that town. You don't need to hang around Seyda at all if you don't want to, but there are, of course, some things you can do if you want to before you leave, such as get yourself outfitted at the very least. And then, when you're ready, you head off to Balmora, you meet with Caius, which is the guy you need to find, and you do actually literally have to find him, as Morrowind doesn't do things like quest markers, so you have to pay attention and read and listen to what these people are telling you, so you can literally find the guy, before he sets you off on an information gathering search, which then leads into the big and mystical main story. But even in Balmora, rather than push you to track down that main story, rather what they do is use Balmora as a staging point to get you invested in everything else the game has to offer, such as the factions or the guild storylines, all while at the same time forcing you to learn about how the world works, how the great houses of Morrowind are set up. They actively encourage you to get immersed in the local history. Caius will literally give you reading material about recent happenings. And I tell you all that to tell you that one of my impressions of playing this game again in 2024 is realizing how embarrassingly short my attention span must have been for the last decade or so when I've tried this game previously, because when I'm actively engaged with this game, it is giving me answers to all of my questions, everything that I've complained about previously. And it's very funny looking back at this and realizing that I think a lot of my previous problems with Morrowind were very much so self-inflicted, because it really does try to push you in the proper direction at every turn. But while much can be said, and I will say a great deal about Morrowind's systems and things that haven't aged well, what has aged very well is actually the world, of course. Morrowind, to this day, still feels like a very unique setting to the second you get off the boat. And even as you're engaging with guilds and things for the first time and how they talk to each other and how you can approach NPCs and taunt them to attack you so you can just kill them without consequence to achieve some goal of yours, for instance. And little stuff like that pulls you in more and more if you're willing to get past that initial information hurdle, which I myself failed to do many times. And honestly, it's a pretty easy thing to do because Morrowind's flaws are very self-apparent. And while I really don't care much these days about graphics, Morrowind has plenty of janky systems that go well beyond graphics. For instance, you can equip a shield, but you don't block in Morrowind. The block is automatic. Much like your chance to hit, you either make a successful chance to block roll or you don't, which feels very weird in a game like this. The magic system can be really awkward because whereas melee weapons and everything have your chance to hit, your spells have a chance to fail. That is to say, you just don't cast them properly to begin with. And that chance for a successful cast is made even more frustrating because if you try to build a mage in this game, you might want to go with higher powered spells, but that would be a mistake because you actually gain levels by casting spells successfully many times over. And if things are dying quickly to your spells, you're casting less of them, which means you don't level up as fast, which leads to things like efficient leveling or going out of your way to level very deliberately as opposed to naturally while you play, still being a thing, which is something that carried over into Oblivion. Which is all to tell you that here in 2024, experiencing Morrowind in any capacity is still just that, an experience, especially if it's your first time playing it, period, or in my case, resolving to finally finish the thing. There's so many little things you'll see and remember or forget about and have to relearn. But in spite of that, it still manages to feel rewarding. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that feeling applies to the rest of the game, the parts that I've just never seen before I wind up making that retrospective review. Which brings me to the sort of wrap-up section of this video. My plan for Morrowind is as follows. My first run through the game is going to be just how I want to play it. Morrowind has a few exclusive faction quest lines and things like that, stuff you can actually miss because it is mutually exclusive with other parts of the content. But my first time through, just gonna do the things I want to do and just whatever feels natural to me at the time. And then subsequently after that, I'm gonna run through a couple, I wouldn't even say full playthroughs, but with other characters just to see the things I missed before doing a sort of wiki sweep to make sure I didn't miss anything major that I want to experience before talking about it at length. Now, all of that is going to take me a little bit of time. I mean, truth be told, if I could dedicate just a period to it all at once, I think it would maybe take like a couple weeks. That is to say, a week or two. But with so many new games releasing soon, such as Dragon's Dogma 2, Geneforge, and a couple more in April, this is going to get interrupted on my part. So it's going to take me a little bit, which basically means don't expect the follow-up to this until probably towards the later half of April at the earliest. as I mostly just wanted to put this video out to talk about a few of the basics, what my approach and plan was going to be, alongside some of my general feelings. And I hope this video accomplished that. Feels a little rambly on my end, truth be told, but I hope some people got something out of it. And if you're looking forward to a much more detailed deep dive, that'll be, of course, coming eventually here in a few weeks. But for today, that's pretty much going to wrap it up. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.